Whispers of the Moonlit Vale. Chapter 1. The Moonlit Warning. The Vale of Illyria was a land forever touched by moonlight. No sun ever rose here, only the pale glow of the moon casting silvery shadows over the towering trees and shimmering rivers. The air was thick with ancient magic, a pulse that beat with both life and decay. The Vale, once a sanctuary of the Fae, now bore the weight of a curse that poisoned its heart. Lyra walked quietly through the forest, her feet barely disturbing the fallen leaves beneath her. She had always known this place was special. She could feel the magic of the land, like a song whispered just for her. It had always been this way, ever since she was a child. But now that same magic felt different, heavier, darker. Something was wrong. A rustling in the underbrush caught her attention. Kneeling down, she found a stag, a creature of the Fae, with silvery antlers, lying on its side injured. A dark wound oozed on its flank, a twisted black gash that pulsed with a strange energy. Without hesitation, Lyra placed her hands over the wound, closing her eyes as her magic stirred within her. A soft golden light glowed from her fingertips, and slowly the wound began to heal. The stag's breathing steadied, and its eyes, glowing softly in the moonlight, met hers. There was a deep understanding between them. It rose shakily at first, then bowed its head in thanks before disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Lyra stood, her heart heavy. She was a healer, a gift inherited from her Fae ancestors. But in the village, she was always an outsider, looked upon with suspicion. People came to her for help when they needed it, but they feared the magic in her veins. She lived alone, on the edge of the village, far from the whispered rumors that she was not fully human. Tonight, the forest itself seemed to whisper to her. The wind picked up, a chill cutting through the stillness of the moonlit night. The trees around her bent toward her as if drawn by an invisible force. Lyra's pulse quickened. Something was coming. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind, deep and ancient, more felt than heard. The curse! It awakens! She staggered back as a vision overwhelmed her. She saw the Vale, its beauty consumed by darkness, tendrils of black magic unfurling from its heart like a disease, swallowing the trees, the rivers, the villages. The sky darkened, and the eternal moonlight turned red with the blood of those who would fall to the curse. And in the center of it all, Lyra saw herself. "The Vale's fate rests on you," the voice whispered, growing faint. "Only you can break the curse, but the price will be great. Life or love." The vision faded, leaving her breathless. The forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened, but the weight of the prophecy clung to her. She was meant to break the curse that had plagued the Vale for centuries. But at what cost? She could feel the magic inside her, responding to the call, but the fear of what it might demand made her hesitate. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't a hero. She was just Lyra, the healer, the outcast. Yet she knew there was no turning back. The Vale was in danger, and she was the only one who could save it. Chapter 2. The Exiled Prince. High above the forest, perched on the jagged cliffs overlooking the Vale, Kyle watched in silence. His silver eyes gleamed faintly in the moonlight, tracking Lyra's every movement. He had known of her for some time now, watched her from a distance as she wandered through the cursed woods, oblivious to the power she carried within her. Kyle's lips curled into a bitter smile. She didn't know yet, but she was part of the prophecy, just as he was. She was destined to break the curse, but Kyle had other plans. Once Kale had been a prince of the Fae. He had stood among the most powerful in the Fae court, with a future bright and filled with promise. But the curse had changed everything. It had stolen from him the only thing that had ever mattered, his love. the one person who had made him believe in the beauty of the Vale. Now all that remained was his thirst for revenge. The Fae court had exiled him after the curse took hold, blaming him for the darkness that had seeped into their world. Alone and cast out, Kyle had wandered the fringes of the Vale, seeking a way to control the curse to harness its power for his own ends. He would not let it destroy him as it had destroyed his love. Instead, he would bend it to his will. But now, watching Lyra, he felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that she was the key to the curse. It was something else, something deeper. He saw her healing the wounded stag, her magic glowing in the darkness, and for a moment he was reminded of who he had once been. A man who had believed in the goodness of the Vale, in its magic and its beauty. But that man was gone. Kyle's eyes hardened. He couldn't let Lyra break the curse, not unless he could use it to reclaim what was rightfully his. He would make contact with her, test her, see if she could be swayed to his side. If not, he would have to find another way. For now, he would remain in the shadows, watching, waiting. Chapter 3. The journey begins. Lyra couldn't sleep after the vision. The weight of the prophecy pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She tossed and turned, but no amount of rest would come to her. Her mind kept replaying the dark tendrils of magic creeping through the Vale, the destruction she had seen, and the cryptic warning: life or love. At dawn, or what passed for dawn in the Vale, Lyra packed her belongings and left the village without a word. The villagers wouldn't understand. They had never trusted her magic, and they certainly wouldn't believe in a prophecy that required her to save the world. But she knew what she had to do. She walked into the forest, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. The trees were old here, their bark blackened by the curse, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The deeper she went, the more she felt the magic of the Vale pulling her forward, urging her onward. She wasn't alone for long. As she rounded a bend in the path, she sensed something or someone watching her. Her pulse quickened, and she turned, scanning the shadows. From the darkness of the trees, a figure stepped forward, tall, cloaked in black, with silver eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. His face was sharp, beautiful, in a way that only Fae could be. But there was something dangerous about him, something that made Lyra take a step back. "Going somewhere, little healer?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like the sharp blade of a knife. Lyra squared her shoulders. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who knows more about the curse than you do." "Then why not break it yourself?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Because it's not my destiny. It's yours." Lyra's heart raced. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her as if she were some puzzle he was trying to figure out. "I can help you," he said after a moment, "but you'll need to trust me." Something in his tone made her blood run cold. She didn't trust him, not for a second, but she knew she couldn't do this alone, and if he truly knew more about the curse, then maybe she didn't have a choice. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Kyle," he said simply. "And yours?" "Lyra." He smiled again, that same cold, calculating smile. "Lyra," he repeated, tasting the name. "We're going to do great things together, you and I." Chapter 4. A Heart of Darkness. The further Lyra and Kyle travelled into the heart of the Vale, the darker the forest became. The trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark blackened by the curse. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the magic that once sang to Lyra now felt oppressive, suffocating. Kyle was never far behind her, always watching, always waiting. He offered no explanations for his motives, only cryptic remarks and unsettling smiles. but he never left her side, and when dark creatures born from the curse attacked, he fought alongside her, his silver magic slicing through the shadows like a blade. Lyra wanted to trust him, but something about him made her wary. His presence was intoxicating, and despite herself, she was drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. But there was a darkness in Kyle, a bitterness that clung to him like a second skin. And no matter how many times she tried to push the thought away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle had his own plans for the curse, and for her. One night, after a particularly brutal battle with a pack of cursed wolves, they camped in a small clearing. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows across Kyle's face. He sat in silence, staring into the flames, his jaw clenched tight. "You weren't always like this," Lyra said softly, watching him. Cale's eyes flickered up to meet hers. Like what? Bitter? Angry? He let out a low, humorless laugh. "What would you know of it?" Lyra held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I know enough. I've seen what the curse does to people, but I've also seen how it can be broken." Kyle's expression hardened. "And you think you can save me?" "No," she said quietly. "Only you can do that." He stared at her for a long moment, the firelight dancing in his silver eyes. For the first time, Lyra saw something other than anger in them. Pain, loss, vulnerability. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. "You're wasting your time, Lyra," he said, his voice cold once more. "I'm beyond saving." Chapter 5. Secrets of the Prophecy. The hidden temple stood deep in the heart of the cursed forest, overgrown with vines and bathed in the same pale, sickly light that seemed to cling to the entire vale. Lyra felt the pull of the temple long before she saw it, a tug in her chest that led her to its stone doors. The walls were etched with runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she approached the altar at the center of the temple. Carved into the stone were images of two figures, one fae, one human, standing together, their hands raised in unity. "The prophecy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was never just about me." Kyle, who had been standing in the shadows, stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" Lyra traced her fingers over the carvings, her heart pounding. "The prophecy. It's about both of us. We were meant to break the curse together." Kyle's eyes darkened. "You're wrong." "I'm not," she insisted, turning to face him. "This is why we were brought together. We're supposed to break the curse, Kyle." His jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But instead he turned away, his shoulders tense. "And what if I don't want to break it?" Lyra's heart ached at his words. She had seen glimpses of the man Kyle used to be, the man he could be again. But he was so consumed by his anger, his thirst for revenge, that he couldn't see past it. "You don't have to choose revenge," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "You can choose something else. You can choose to help me." Kyle turned to face her, his silver eyes flashing with a mix of anger and something else, something raw, something vulnerable. "And what makes you think I'm capable of choosing anything else?" Lyra held his gaze, her heart racing. "Because I see the man you're trying to hide, the one who still believes in the veil, the one who still believes in love." Kale's expression softened just for a moment, but then his walls came crashing back down. "I can't," he whispered. Chapter 6. Love and Betrayal. The tension between Lyra and Kale had been building for days, an unspoken bond growing stronger with every battle they fought, every conversation they had. And yet, despite the growing closeness, there was always something between them, a wall that Kyle had built, a barrier Lyra didn't know how to break. But that night, after hours of walking in silence, something changed. The air was thick with anticipation, the curse growing stronger with every step they took toward the heart of the Vale. Kyle's eyes were dark, his jaw set, and Lyra could feel the storm brewing inside him. Suddenly he stopped, turning to face her. His eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Because I have to," Lyra said, her heart pounding. Kale took a step closer, his silver eyes burning into hers. "No, Lyra, why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for a place that will never accept you? For a prophecy that will destroy you?" Lyra swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Because it's my destiny." "Destiny," Kyle spat, his voice filled with disdain. "Destiny is nothing but a lie." "No," she said softly, stepping toward him. "It's not a lie. Not if we choose to make it real." Kyle's breath hitched, and for a moment Lyra saw the conflict in his eyes, the war raging inside him. Without thinking, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "You don't have to do this alone, Kyle." He stared at her, his silver eyes wide with shock, and then, before she could say anything else, he kissed her. The world seemed to stop as their lips met, the tension between them finally breaking. Kyle's hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, and Lyra felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't expected but couldn't deny. But just as quickly as the moment had begun, it was over. Kyle pulled away, his eyes filled with regret. "I can't do this." Lyra's heart sank. "Kale, I can't," he said again, his voice trembling. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lyra standing alone in the moonlit clearing. Chapter 7. The Breaking of the Curse. The heart of the curse was a swirling mass of black magic, a vortex of darkness that pulsed with chaotic energy. The trees around it were dead, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Lyra and Kale stood side by side, their hands clasped, their magic intertwining as they faced the curse together. "We can do this," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "Together." Kyle's grip tightened around her hand. "I trust you." With a final burst of energy, they unleashed their combined magic, golden and silver light swirling together as they poured everything they had into breaking the curse. The dark tendrils of magic shattered, and the vortex dissolved into nothingness. For the first time in centuries, the eternal moonlight faded, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Chapter 8. Dawn of a New Era. The Vale was healing. The trees, once blackened and twisted, were now lush and green, their branches filled with new life. The rivers flowed clear and bright, and the creatures that had once been cursed now roamed freely, their eyes glowing with magic once more. Lyra stood beside Kyle, her heart full as she watched the Vale come back to life. The curse had been broken, but more than that, something had shifted between them. They had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, they had found something deeper, something that could never be broken. "You did it," Kyle said softly, his voice filled with awe. Lyra smiled, her eyes meeting his. "We did it." Kyle's hand found hers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. Chapter 9. Love in the Vale. Word spread quickly through the Vale. The curse was broken, and Lyra and Kale were hailed as heroes. Humans and Fae alike came together in celebration, their differences forgotten as they embraced the new era of peace. But for Lyra and Kyle, the greatest victory wasn't the breaking of the curse. It was the bond they had forged, the love that had grown between them despite everything that had stood in their way. One evening, as the sun set over the newly restored Vale, Lyra and Kale stood on the edge of the forest, their hands intertwined. "We've come a long way," Lyra said softly. Kyle nodded, his silver eyes filled with warmth. And we have further still to go. Lyra smiled, leaning into him. As long as we're together. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The Vale thrived under Lyra and Kyle's protection. The harmony between humans and Fae was restored, and Lyra's dual heritage allowed her to act as a bridge between the two worlds. Together they rebuilt the Vale, not as it had been, but as it was always meant to be. A place of peace, of magic, of love. As they walked through the forest, hand in hand, Lyra and Kale knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Because in the end, it wasn't destiny that had brought them together. It was love. The end.